We know that in the 40s and 50s there were 500,000 dwellings built, but the figure for the 60s and 70s is probably between 750,000 and 1 million.
Is it possible to turn that into the number of people affected and say how many people are living in defective or potentially defective?
Yes, I should think the number of people that are living in defective or potentially defective dwellings is probably up to 6 million.
Can you put a cost of the total amount you'll be spending to remedy all these defects?
Yes, the estimated figure for Leeds City Council is £458 million.
And how much did you get last year from the government?
We got from the government less than £8 million to spend on capitalised repairs of the type we've talked about this morning.
So you need more than 50 times that amount?
We do.
What will happen if you don't get it?
Well, clearly buildings will become progressively unsafe, and we would have to vacate certain properties and either board them up or demolish them.
With no alternative accommodation, many councils are desperately trying to remedy the defects in their system-built housing stock so that their tenants can go on living in them. A new industry has sprung up, offering methods of repairing the systems. Tower blocks hundreds of feet high are being completely recovered or reclad in new materials, guaranteed to prevent rain reaching the joints. When the housing department dealing with the Trowbridge estate in London were trying to solve the problem of water leakage, they were offered 4 different commercial systems to choose from.
Could you tell me what happened when you tested the systems that had been suggested for use at Trowbridge?
Well, in that case, the criterion was quite simply that the system would prevent rainwater crossing a small cavity and wetting the insulation, which was to be fixed on the outside of the blocks. And to our surprise, none of the systems tested succeeded in doing this.
Did the systems fail the test badly?
Some of them did, some failed very badly, but some were not so bad. They failed comparatively narrowly, but it would have been important. We were dealing with a 3-metre square panel. If you consider that area grossed up to the size of a high-rise block, then obviously it's serious enough.
Are those systems being used by other local authorities?
Well, so far as I know, yes, but whether they're being used in precisely the same form, I have no way of telling.
The only way that you can repair the present industrialised systems, or virtually the only way, is by the use of other untried and untested remedial works. And so we're actually finding that there are now systems of repair coming in to repair the systems-built dwellings in the first place. And we already have evidence of some of those repair systems failing because they've been inadequately researched and evaluated.
What sort of risks do you think there are from using systems that haven't been appraised properly?
Well, to take a very obvious one, there's the fire risk, and I think it's absolutely essential that anything that is being placed on or around existing blocks should be considered very carefully in relation to a serious fire. There's the problem of weather tightness that we've already mentioned, where if water is dripping inside a system for years, it may make the situation much worse than it ever was before the cladding was placed.
On the question of a fire risk, do you think that there are now systems being used which represent a fire risk?
Frankly, yes.
Would you be prepared to name them?
No.
When professionals now tell us that the remedial work being done on high-rise blocks is adequate and will solve the problem, should we trust them?
If I say yes, will you call me complacent? I would take everything they say with a pinch of salt.
It's very difficult to, as an amateur, my job is to look after tenants and manage housing. I'm not an engineer or a surveyor. It's difficult as an amateur to criticise professionals. But the only way I can respond to the question is to say that the calming and impressive manner of these well-heeled professionals who argue that these buildings are safe or can be made safe is exactly the same kind of information and argument that was put by the very people who designed them in the first place. Those people, those experts, built these buildings that have now been shown to warrant £33 million worth of repairs. That's £33 million worth of a professional mistake. And the cost of that has to be met, because the builder went bankrupt and the professionals responsible can't be nailed for it. The cost of that has to be found by ratepayers and rentpayers. And rentpayers in this borough are ratepayers too. And the cost falls back on the tenants. And on this estate, a large number of the tenants are unwaged, below the poverty line, and elderly people. And if you're asking me to accept the word of people that built this rubbish, and to accept their arguments for remedial works, and to say that because they're professionals I must believe it, I'm asking you to believe me that a £33 million mistake is evidence for the amateur to argue that you reject the so-called professional arguments. You listen to the tenants, you look with your own eyes, and you use the evidence of those observations and the horror stories that people tell you of the problems they've had with flooding and defects and deficiencies, and you are guided by them and not by so-called professionals who, frankly, I don't believe have a clue about what they're doing here.
Do you think that many of the men who worked on the buildings actually now live in them?
I wouldn't say any of them live in them, or any of them would have ever lived in them.
Why not?
Well, they know the risk and the danger.